In 1939, the philosopher Martin Buber spoke to a large audience of teachers, and in that speech he said the following: "Education worthy of the name is essentially education of character." Let that line sit with you a minute. I don't think Buber meant that we should develop a unit on values and then glue that onto the existing curriculum. I don't think he meant that problem children should be taught how to behave. He was saying that the very profession of teaching calls on us to try to produce not merely good learners, but good people. When I've spoken to teachers all over the place, I typically begin by asking them, as I do when I speak to parents, what are your long-term goals for your kids? How do you hope they'll turn out? And I get a very similar set of answers every time I ask the question, but what really strikes me is that teachers, just like parents, tend to think about the answer to that question about their long-term goals, not primarily in terms of academic outcomes, but in terms of wanting kids to be, as parents and teachers both tell me, happy, healthy, ethical, responsible, resourceful, caring, compassionate, independent, that kind of thing. That's really interesting, that even teachers, with the pressures on them to produce certain outcomes, are focused on something that looks very much like what I think Buber meant by character. Now, given that even the more modest task of producing good learners can sometimes seem impossibly ambitious, partly because of the misplaced emphasis on producing good test takers, it may seem positively utopian to talk about character. But the need for schools to play an active role in shaping character, I think, has grown more pressing in the almost century since Buber said that. I mean, at a tender age, kids learn not to be tender. A dozen years of schooling often do nothing to promote a commitment to the welfare of others. You've got a lot of students graduated from high school who think that being smart means looking out for number one. So how can teachers, along with parents, make it more likely that kids will rise above self-centeredness, that they'll become genuinely concerned about others and act to promote their well-being? That's our topic today on Kohn Zone. I'm Alfie Kohn. So of all of the characteristics that I'm putting under the rubric of good people as opposed to just good learners, the constellation, the cluster I want to really focus on has to do with caring. And specifically, I've been giving this a lot of thought for a long time. I want to frame that goal more specifically in these ways. And you can decide for yourself whether these kind of objectives make sense to you too. Beyond just in broad terms helping kids to become caring, I want them to develop an enduring commitment to what psychologists call a prosocial orientation. That's deep in their bones, that commitment. And I want them to take pleasure from helping people, sure, but I also want them to help even when it isn't particularly pleasurable, even when there's no benefit to them. That's the subset of a prosocial orientation that could be described as altruism. It means transcending a kind of self-interested motivation. If that's all we were interested in, we would emphasize just reciprocity, And that's what some parents of young children do, whether they mean to or not. If you say to your kid, hey, if you let Jeremy play with your Legos, I'll bet he'd let you play with his puzzle. That doesn't promote caring. That promotes self-regarding shrewdness. So I want us to go beyond just self-interest. And I want that commitment to caring to be a matter of the head and the heart. I want kids to have a rational commitment to morality, to understanding values and principles, and not just understanding them, but to be committed to them, but at the same time to have an affective connection to others, to feel with them, which is what the word empathy means. And finally, I want this prosocial orientation to be generalized, to go beyond the people they know, or the people they like, or the people they look like. It's sort of like the First Amendment, the concept of free speech. You need it for speech you find offensive. You don't need a First Amendment for speech you already agree with. It's no big deal to help out your close friends. It is a big deal when you help out people you don't even know. So that's my goal. How can teachers do this? First, we have to realize two things that are implicit about everything I've just been saying. Motives matter. This is the umpteenth time you will have heard me say this if you've listened to other episodes of Kohn Zone, that it's not just about the behavior you can observe. It's about the inner experience, the subjective component of this, the reason people act as they do. That's implicit in much of what I've been saying about going beyond just saying, do kind things for other people. And the other thing I think we need to keep in mind is this goes beyond self-discipline. It goes beyond having kids swallow whole our values and priorities, introjecting them, as the psychoanalysts used to say. That's just about controlling kids through remote control. It's about helping kids become the kind of people who will actively construct that commitment to helping, so it really comes from them and is integrated into their personality. So, how can teachers do this? I want to emphasize half a dozen ways that will play out differently, of course, in different classrooms. First, if we want kids to care, they have to feel cared about. And obviously, that's most important at home, but it's also pretty damn important in the classroom, that they experience their teachers, not just as caring people in the abstract, but that we care about them. This is pretty clear in developmental psychology, is that people need to have their needs met in order to free them up, psychologically speaking, to be able to meet other people's needs. Otherwise, if your own needs are just echoing relentlessly, lifelong in your ears, you are unable to hear, so to speak, the cries of others. We have to care about them so they feel safe, which allows them to take risks, to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, to avoid a constant sort of crouched position of defensiveness, to be able to grow. So if we want to be caring, if we want them to experience us as caring, which is what ultimately matters, their experience, not just what we think we're doing. To be a caring person, first you've got to be a person. And that means for teachers to not be afraid to show ourselves as vulnerable human beings with lives of our own, as opposed to just a capital T teacher who's always in control. who knows everything, whose word always carries the day. And we need to connect with them in ways where they feel cared about, to write them little notes, to have lunch with the kids, at least sometimes, to have them keep journals and respond to them, and not just to correct their grammar, but to respond as a reader to a writer, to remember details of their lives. Oh, Luann, didn't you say that your parents over the weekend were going to take you to the zoo? Did you end up going? What was that like? 100 little examples where we attend to them, give them the gift of our attention, remember the details they've mentioned later, ask with genuine curiosity about their lives. All of that adds up to the kind of caring connection with kids that I think is necessary, though not sufficient, to help them be able to care about others. Second is to model, to set an example, to admit when we make mistakes, to admit when we're in a bad mood, to apologize when we think we may have hurt their feelings, which is much more powerful and authentic than simply instructing kids that they should say they're sorry even when they're not, to sometimes be a little emotional rather than pretending we don't have emotions, keeping it, of course, in check so it doesn't become overwhelming for young kids in particular, but to react to their distress with distress rather than to be a machine, to model helping, to show them how to be a caring person by demonstrating that in the way we care about others. But there's a caveat here. You don't want kids to learn that they don't have to help each other because the adult will always swoop in and take care of the problem and help and rescue the person who's in distress. So that's sort of a balance to strike, a tightrope to walk, to model helping but leave room for them to help as well, and to model acceptance of helping. There's a word in our society for people who seem unable to admit that they themselves need help sometimes. That word is men. And it is a kind of socialization that we often undergo. And so we should set an example for kids of accepting help and acknowledging we need it sometimes, just as we show them that we help and that that's the right thing to do. And by the way, if you're a teacher or a parent, you're always modeling them. Sometimes we take it in our heads, I'm going to now set an example for kids by doing X while they watch me. Well, they were watching you an hour ago, too, when you snapped at somebody who walked in through the door. They're always learning. They're always learning how to be a person by watching the kind of people we are. That's quite a responsibility, and it can be overwhelming at times. But it's important to realize that modeling is something we're doing, like it or not. So let's be more attentive to modeling the kinds of things that will help them be good people. Third, we should, in our heads, not just in our actions, think about kids and the reasons they do things in order to promote them doing their best. Nell Noddings, the late great philosopher of education, said we should attribute to children the best possible motive consistent with the facts. We often don't know why they have acted the way they did. Why assume the worst? Why assume they're being selfish or destructive or whatever when we don't know? Because kids pick up pretty young, pretty cleverly on what we seem to be assuming about them, even when we don't say it out loud, and have a sort of perverse tendency to live down to negative attributions we make about kids in general or about them in particular. If instead, when we're not sure why a kid acted the way she did, we assume the best. If there was a screw-up, we don't assume nastiness, but assume that the child needs more instruction, more guidance, or simply more time because it reflected immaturity. You know, the kind of adults who scream at kids, that I just told you not to do that and you did it again. Are you dense? Are you deaf? And the kid is thinking, no, I'm 5. The developmental limitations, as well as the fact that some things happen accidentally. Rules are hard to remember. By attributing to kids the best possible motive, again, as Nodding says, that are consistent with the facts, that don't seem bizarre or unrealistic, by attributing the best to them, we create an auspicious circle instead of a vicious circle where they live up to our beliefs about what they can be in the context of caring and in the context of other things as well. Fourth, don't just set an example, don't just believe the best about them, explain to them the rationale for our requests, for things that they're not allowed to do. People of all ages are owed an explanation when they're told you must or you can't. A psychologist named Martin Hoffman coined the term inductive discipline as opposed to power-based discipline. And by inductive, he meant we induce kids to reflect on the impact of their actions on others. And we can not only assume what those impacts are, we can help kids, especially when they're young, to see the connection, as opposed to the power-based because I said so approach. And that means, among other things, that we reject the false dichotomy of either we punish them when they're bad, we make them suffer when they've caused somebody else to suffer, or we're permissive and we just let it go. The alternative to those is what I like to call a working with approach, which, among other things, involves helping them see how the thing they did may have hurt someone else's feelings. It's not that I, the person with the power, said, don't do this, or worse, you'll be punished if you do it. It's, here's how your actions affected somebody else. The same goes for stuff that may have helped others, as opposed to praise, which is that patronizing pat on the head that says, I approve of what you did. Help them see that their act may have helped another child to feel good, thereby helping the child to construct a real commitment to wanting to have that effect on others in the future. Explanations, of course, are not all that we have to do. Kids aren't just absorbers. They have to do that active constructing. And that's connected to my fifth suggestion, which is very simple and I think pretty self-explanatory. Give them a chance to practice helping. Whatever that means, taking care of pets, in the animals in the classroom, setting things up in a cooperative fashion so that kids succeed together, and helping is built into the pedagogy. Kids need a chance to stretch these muscles and flex them so they're not just convinced that caring for others is a nice thing to do, they have a chance to actually do it. And sixth, with all of this, I would suggest helping to construe the idea of caring through the concept of what psychologists call perspective taking, which means imagining how the world looks from the perspective of other people. That is sometimes, I think, erroneously or at least imprecisely called empathy. Empathy is where you literally feel along with someone else's feeling. They're sad, it makes you sad too. Perspective taking is an act of the imagination. The most literal kind is spatial perspective taking. When I'm standing in front of a bunch of people and talking, and I talk about going from left to right, I automatically reverse that and do my right to the left because I'm thinking about your left and right as you're facing me. And it takes kids a few years to get that. Beyond spatial perspective taking is cognitive perspective taking, imagining how you think about things. You can't really teach fractions well until you make real for yourself the idea of how weird it is to see a number sitting on top of another number for the first time. Taking the perspective of the learner helps you become a better teacher. Imagining how somebody else looks at controversial issues different from your own. That's a challenge that many adults fall short on. And finally, the one that's most likely confused with empathy is affective perspective taking, which is where you don't just imagine the space or the ideas, you imagine the other person's feelings. That's a habit to really cultivate and to help kids to cultivate as well. You're sitting in a theater and you're annoyed by that person sitting in front of you with a big head. You're stretching, you're trying to look around this person, and then suddenly it occurs to you, I'm not just blocked here, I may be a blocker, and you turn around and look behind you. That's something we need to do with kids. Kids have the capacity for empathy, for feeling the way others around us feel from birth. In fact, Martin Hoffman, who I mentioned a moment ago, did some studies showing that newborns cry more loudly in response to other babies crying than they do in response to equally sudden and loud noises, as if we're hardwired to be distressed by other people's distress. That's lovely. But perspective taking, the ability to imagine other people's feelings and thoughts, that takes more time to cultivate, and it requires some help on the part of adults to do that. It means going beyond the golden rule. Do unto others as they would have you do unto you. No, as George Bernard Shaw once said, don't do that. Other people look at things differently. They may have different tastes, and we might add different histories and perspectives. It's not just about how I would feel in your situation. It's about how you feel in your situation. The golden rule is great for 5-year-olds, but it's a very unambitious premise for ethical behavior for adults. And perspective taking is linked to prosocial actions and to intellectual development, by the way. You get to be a better thinker, not just a more caring person, as you develop this theory of mind, this capacity to de-center and go outside yourself, to make other people real. It gets in the way of bad stuff all the way from littering to war. I mean, what is littering when you drop something on the sidewalk, if not self-centeredness and the incapacity of imagining how that dirty sidewalk is going to look to somebody else coming along later? As for war, Kafka said that war is a monstrous failure of the imagination. It's the failure to really make real somebody else's reality. It's active dehumanization of others, which is required in order to kill them or to root for them being killed as if they're just objects. So for perspective taking in particular, this can be incorporated in all kinds of activities in the curriculum, the literature, lots of stories, fiction that we read with kids in class. Really great stories are often about shifting perspectives, looking at the world from different characters' points of view, and even stories that don't have that built in. Well, we can allow kids, encourage kids to retell stories from the perspective of a minor character and so on. It can be incorporated in conflict resolution and caring in general through class meetings where we make decisions, cooperative learning where kids are learning in pairs and in small groups, unity building activities where classes come together to decorate the classroom or decide on class song or a color that's going to represent who we are. Literature chosen to promote not only kids' capacity to read and write well, but to think about various values. In grade schools, there's lots of cross-age interaction, multi-age classrooms, buddy activities, where older and younger kids come together on a regular basis to sit in assemblies together, go on field trips together, go to the library and read books together, whole school activities. It's powerful for younger kids to feel cared about by older kids too, not just adults. And it's an example of learning to care by having the opportunity to care for the older kids to do this as well. Throughout the class day, interdependence, not just independence, is important. It's a touchstone. I remember many, many years ago, I first heard about an activity done in elementary schools where young kids on the first day of class were given something that was the outline of a shield and asked to personalize the shield by putting pictures, icons, words that represented who they were. Draw your own shield. And I still remember my reaction when I heard about that activity. My first reaction was, why are you having kids draw their own shields when you could pair them up and have them draw each other's shields after talking to one another? Doesn't take any more time, but the relentless focus on oneself is a missed opportunity to learn to be a caring person. Oh, and I should also mention that it's kind of nice for administrators to promote the caring collaboration of the staff, too, so teachers don't feel off on their own little islands or get in little cliques and so on. Adults who feel cared about with their peers are in a better position to do the kinds of things I'm describing with kids. But there are barriers to this. Some of them are attitudinal, cynical beliefs about human nature, about children. Our society's obsession with self-reliance every day gets in the way of caring. But there are also practical barriers, right? There's segregation by age, by ethnicity, by alleged ability, which I talked about in a different episode having to do with the amazing value of diversity. It's hard to promote caring actively when you got too many kids in a school or in a classroom, or too little time together with a group of people to develop that sense of community. It precludes meaningful interaction with one another and with adults from the kids' perspective. What else gets in the way? Oh, competition. Any activity that pits kids against one another actively destroys the desire to care. And there's lots of research on this that says that the experience of competition measurably reduces the inclination to do perspective taking and to engage in generous acts. So anything we do to reduce or better yet eliminate competition, either the obvious hit you over the head kind or the subtler kind. Who can tell me the answer to this question? And the kids are waving their hands to be the first to be recognized. That's not a caring classroom. It's also not a classroom about thinking. It's just about regurgitating the fact that the teacher wants. But competition gets in the way. That's another barrier. Well, also, as you've heard me say before, rewards or punishment are inherently focused on self-interest. When punitive consequences are used for what the teacher decides is misbehavior, the kid learns to ask, what does she want me to do? And what happens to me if I don't do it? When rewards, including praise, are offered, kids are led to ask the question, what does she want me to do? And what do I get for doing it? All positive reinforcement, all punitive consequence, aside from their other problems, retard moral development by focusing kids' attention relentlessly on the impact of their actions on themselves rather than on others. And whenever teachers engage in a kind of doing to, punitive or reward-based approach to classroom management, it models bullying, it warps the relationships among kids as each scrambles to be the one to get the goodie, and it certainly warps our relationship with the kids. All of this looks quite different in a kindergarten than it does in a high school classroom, of course. And none of this means that we should ignore intellectual development, even just academic development. That proficiency matters too. Indeed, they go together. There are, as I hinted at briefly, intellectual benefits of perspective taking. Also, when you have literature that promotes certain values, you are also helping them to develop the usual language arts skills at the same time. Cooperative learning, when kids are learning with each other on a regular basis. Research shows that promotes their academic skills at the same time, that it leads to a deeper connection to others. It's both practically possible and arguably necessary to recall what are likely our own long-term goals for kids. And Buber's challenge, that education itself is basically education of character. We should be asking about every lesson, about every classroom interaction. How can I maximize the chances that what I'm doing here will help these kids to become decent, caring human beings?